And then I purchased the water-based inks, and the key holders, the printmakers at the shop, they were pissed.
Hello, print friends, and welcome. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf, and I release weekly episodes with people around the world who share our love of printmaking. If you like what we do, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. It really does make a world of difference. Or just tell a fellow print friend about the show, and maybe they'll enjoy it too. We also have a Patreon page where supporters join at tiers that start at just $1 a month, and that truly helps us to keep bringing you printmaking content every week. You can also get thank yous like exclusive merchandise, as well as access to bonus content, shop talk with our editor, Timothy Pauschak. These are quick and dirty tips and tricks with our guests about materials, processes, business advice, and general studio nonsense. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, check out the link in the show notes. Sign up and hear Tim's chat with today's guest. If you want to save a little cash and still support the show, you can do a yearly subscription. That'll save you 15% off the tier price. Printmaking forever, shun the non-believers. This episode of Hello Print Friends is brought to you by Speedball Art Products, who've been offering a diverse range of high-quality products to your creative practice since 1997. If you've been following along on Instagram, and we really do recommend that you do, you've no doubt seen their newest initiative in the print world, Speedball's Print Posse. Working with some of the most exciting contemporary printmakers on the scene today, they have created a brand new line of custom printing inks and additives to push your practice even further. Artists like Jay Ryan, who's known for his charming and distinctive style of concert posters, which he's been producing in the Chicago area since 1995. His limited edition Posse acrylic screen printing ink, Bird Machine Black, is available for pre-order now. So head on over to the Speedball Posse shop at speedballart.com and find out where you can pick up a can of your new favorite color. There's a link in the show notes. My guest this week is Susan Rostow, founder of Akua Inks. We'll talk about how early childhood experimentation in the kitchen and lack of options for printing safely while pregnant led her to produce the now wildly successful line of water-based inks, as well as her own incredible personal practice that turns printmaking and book arts into intricate, interactive sculptures. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and prepare to build what you want to see in the world with Susan Rostow. Hi, Susan. How's it going?
Hi, Miranda. Wonderful. Here in New York, and very happy to hear from you.
Yeah, I'm so glad we could connect. As we were just chatting about, you mentioned that we might hear a subway going by every 10 minutes, which I think will just be wonderful New York ambiance, especially for people who I'm sure have visited Missing the City in the last 18 months. And
oh, yes.
Yeah, so we'll know that you're really there. So before we dive in, as we were talking about, I've got many questions for you, and I'm really excited to talk and get some history, talk about your practice, talk about Akua Inks, all of it. But would you mind just giving a little introduction to yourself if anyone listening doesn't know who you are, where you are, what you do?
Okay. Well, I am a multimedia artist, and I use printmaking to create sculptural books and sculpture and animation. And I make my own materials. I've been doing this since I was a child, and which is what led me to make Akua printmaking inks. Mm-hmm. And I originally made the inks for myself, and then the inks were acquired by Speedball in 2012.
Wonderful.
And I've stayed on with Speedball, and I act as a freelance consultant with Speedball.
And so where did you grow up, and what role did art play in that part of your life?
Well, I grew up in Philadelphia, but I was born in Brooklyn, so I returned to my home grounds here. Mm-hmm. And as a child, I was very curious about cooking and food and art materials. I sort of combined making concoctions and painting with them.
Oh, really?
It started because my mother taught me to make my own paste. we ran out of paste, and I had a school project in kindergarten, and she showed me how to mix flour and water, and I was just thrilled by that I can make two things stick with
Yeah.
food.
Yeah.
And so then I started adding things to the paste, and I would add ketchup to make red, and then a little mustard to make my orange to the red. And then it just kept going. And then I would paint with them. And then I started making my own tools. I used to use pretzel rods, and I made my own Play-Doh. And I would attach the Play-Doh to the pretzel rod and draw with it, dip it into my concoctions. That's where it really began. So when I did develop Akua, I kind of resorted back to that childhood memory of making my own products.
Oh, that's so fascinating. You showed early genius as someone very interested in homegrown art materials. That's so funny. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then so you had this sort of creative experimentation going on in the kitchen as a child, but then where did printmaking come into your story?
Well, I think the first year when I was in art school, I had to decide to take drawing or painting or sculpture. And I figured, well, I can't just do one or the other. I like doing both. But back in, the 60s, that was what you needed to do, focus.
Right.
And so I figured if I take printmaking, it's sort of like doing both. You're working with metal, you're working with ink, you're working, with a flat dimension. So that's sort of why I went into printmaking originally.
Yeah, it's because you didn't have to choose. And it's actually really interesting to me to find artists who are printmakers, but then also sculptors as well, and how that overlap is really present. And I think it's because, as you say, some of the physicality certainly overlaps. The way you're manipulating a surface with a bit of a 3D mindset, there's a lot of overlap, more, perhaps even more so than, the mixing and the blending and the moving of oils on a flat surface. It can be kind of a maybe more similar mindset for sure. But then, of course, you also get that element as well in the color and everything. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And then, so at what point did you kind of decide you wanted to take on making your own inks, and why?
Well, this is back in the 80s. I grew up in the 50s. So in the late 80s, I was the artistic director at the Lower East Side print shop. And the first day I walked into that shop, it was all oil-based screen printing ink. And the first job that I took on there was to change it, because water-based inks for silkscreen were just starting to develop. And Speedball had a really good water-based ink. And so I threw out, I donated all the oil-based ink from the Lower East Side print shop to the Materials for the Arts program. And then I purchased the water-based inks. And the key holders, the printmakers at the shop, they were pissed.
Oh.
They were not happy with the change. Because back then, this is, before we had computers. And one of the programs that we, did was we had local artists come in, and they would print posters and paste them, billboards all over, the Lower East Side. This is when the Lower East Side print shop was in the Lower East Side. They're in Midtown now. So it was a really community-based print shop. And so the artists would go out if they were going to have an exhibition, or if the theater groups would have, a show, they would print their silk screens and paste them all over. So they were afraid that the water-based ink was not as good, and that the prints would run and we would have problems. Well, after a year, we discovered it was wonderful. And those printmakers who were complaining about me changing over were thanking me.
Yeah.
So then after that, the next task was an intaglio ink, because we also did etching, and, we did the full range. And it was, I knew that was going to be really difficult because there was nothing available.
Yeah.
And also, you need to dampen paper. So,
Right,
water-based
right.
was not
Yeah.
quite the answer for that. And in the meantime, I got married. So this was like in the early 90s, like 1990. And then I was thinking of having a family. And I realized that there was no way I could go into that shop if people, were
Mm-hmm.
printing with solvents and inks and, that were oil-based that, really there were a lot of in that shop. So I knew if I were pregnant, I'd have to stop working. The only thing I knew how to do was teach and,
Yeah.
work in print shops. So that's when I decided to leave the Lower East Side print shop and I started my own shop down the street because I lived like right down the street then. And I decided to make my own ink and I was making it for myself. I never had the intention of going into business or I have no background in chemistry. My background is when I was 5 years old, I
Yeah.
used to make my own paint. So I used that. And so that's where it came from because, the safety of having a child, this is New
Mm.
York City. We live in the same spaces,
Right.
and, it was a small space. So I had to really think about that. So that's why I did it
Yeah.
originally.
And then so to actually take it on, I mean, was it just complete trial and error? Would you have resources? And as you say, it's the early 90s, so you can't just go to Google and say, "Hey Siri, how do I make safe intaglio inks?" This isn't an option.
Exactly.
How did you take it on?
Well, there was the telephone.
Oh.
So basically, I did research. I knew how to make paint.
Mm.
And I started with, I was doing monotype at the time because, tackling on acids and things like that. That was like beyond what I could start with. So I started simple. So I knew what I wanted. I just needed to make a ink. I needed an ink that would have a really long open and had really good quality pigments. So I based it on the history of paint. And I knew that one of the really good ingredients in a water-based, watercolor would be honey. So I started
Ah.
off back in the kitchen. And my first ink that I made was the Akua liquid pigments. Back then it was called Akua color. And then I worked with that and I came up with, a few bottles of ink, 4 colors I started with. And then I started teaching with it because I knew that all the ingredients in there were safe. I selected pigments that I knew had, safe reputations, for no metal, heavy duty metals and things like that. So that's where I started. And then later I came out with the intaglio ink. And the manufacturing, so when I was making it, I made it all by hand myself. But as I was teaching, we kept getting, calls, can I buy it? And eventually, I showed it at during a demo at Southern Graphics. This was
Okay.
back, I think it was in Cincinnati. And then that's when I met Dave Takach at Takach Press. And he was very impressed with it and started ordering it. And then all of a sudden, like 20 bottles became 1,000 bottles.
Right. Yeah. And then what do you do, right?
Yeah. So what I did was, back then it was the yellow pages. And so I was making it myself and I really had no concept of like how you manufacture. I wasn't going to go out and buy a factory. I wasn't going to, start buying a building and things like that. I'm just pretty much myself and my husband. And my husband kept everything going because he was teaching at the time and I was pretty much just developing the inks. So one day I'm looking through the yellow pages and I was looking to buy abrasives. I wanted carborundum in bulk. And you know how fine the yellow pages are and the print.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
instead of abrasive, I wound up calling a company that sell or manufactured adhesives.
Oh.
So I'm having a conversation. The owner, back then you talk to people on the phone. So the guy, picks up the phone and I tell him I'm looking for carborundum. He says, no, we make glue here.
Oh.
And I like to take every mistake I make and make it a good opportunity and learning experience from it. So I said, "Oh, you make adhesives. What kind of glue? How do you make it? What kind of machinery?" So I just kept asking him all these questions. And he says, "You want to come down here?" And so I told him about, what I was doing. So he invited me there. And so I saw the factory. And he did a run. But the problem with that was it was glue. And you would walk on the floor and it was like walking on a mouse trap.
Oh, wow.
It was so sticky and he was so sloppy. So
wow, that's like something out of a cartoon. Like I could just imagine like Tom and Jerry running into a glue factory and the floor is sticky. Like that doesn't seem like the kind of thing that should actually happen in real life.
I love it. Yes, that's exactly what it was like. It was an animation. So we couldn't use him. It was more work cleaning up the sloppy bottles than it was. But what I did learn from him was the language. I learned how, what words to use. And at this time, Google was starting to happen. So then I started Googling. The one word he taught me was toll manufacturer. And that's when you hire someone to manufacture. You're paying someone to manufacture for you. It's like all these words that I didn't really know, the logistics, pick and pack. And so eventually I learned how to, do searches, and find people who would mix it. The problem was I had to mix it, then we had to pack it, and then we had to ship it. And, I can only do so much myself. So I just made arrangements to have things go from one place to another. And it was very, very challenging to handle so many different aspects of not only making, because, it was like having a dinner party and I'm making ink for 4 people. And then suddenly, there's 1,000 people showing up at the table.
Yeah.
You have to change certain things.
Yeah.
It's not the same.
Well, I can only imagine even just like, the very basics of like, oh, all of a sudden, like my raw materials, you would need to now source them in a completely different way to get the volume and make sure that you can still get that volume, but sell it in a cost-effective way. And then, if things change when they're made in larger batches, like it really sounds like it'd be truly taking on in a way, almost an entirely different project or an entirely different set of challenges. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm naive to this. So if I were smart, I would have been so overwhelmed because I would have thought ahead of time what I was getting myself into. But, it kind of grew organically. And I just took one step at a time. And, it just grew. I never really did any advertising or made an attempt to sell anything. It just happened. So I just took one day at a time. And, the math was a real challenge. I can make mistakes on spelling, but like adhesive to abrasive, but you add a couple extra zeros, you're in a lot of trouble.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I've had a few problems, but you get over it and you just keep going. So yeah, I've made a lot of mistakes. Even the name for Akua was a mistake.
Really?
I typed up. Yeah, that was a typo, but I already printed the labels.
What was it supposed to be?
It was supposed to say Aqua, AQUA. And I typed up all these labels and they said AKUA. I must have some kind of, a switch over in the way letters go, because the the Q became a K and the
that is so
D
funny.
became a B. So I go with it, it's like, what are you going to do? So I said, that kind of looks good. So I kept it and it sounds good. So
it does. Here I was thinking it was like, a Japanese word for some sort of, traditional, Zen concept of like purity or something like that. Because that's what it sounds like, that it was, something that really reflects, the what's behind the inks, and it was Akua would have, but Akua. There we go.
Well, it actually is a Hawaiian word, and it is an African word. There's a band named Akua, so it's not like a brand new word. It's not like I made up like Haagen-Dazs,
Right.
It's a word, but that wasn't the original intention.
That's so funny. So you had this experience where you sort of you started making a product for yourself because it was something that didn't exist, and you wanted to see it in the world and you wanted to use it, and then it catches on, and now you're an entrepreneur, and you need to, start manufacturing at a larger scale. And then, so that kind of goes on for a while, and did you ever look at kind of expanding or kind of leaning into that more, or creating, a huge breadth of colors, or going into, every different sort of ink? What was sort of that point, after it had caught on and before Speedball comes into the picture? What was that like for you?
Well, I took things very simply. I never, got a business plan. I never had a loan. I did it. We started out with 4 bottles of ink, and within the 4 bottles, when we started making a profit, then I would add on another color. So we eventually wound up with like 25 colors and 2 lines, and then accessories that went with that. So I did it slowly. And then basically, once everything started running really smoothly, I was just taking my time, building it up as I would naturally, not with the sense of, I'm going to try to make a profit, just more out of the love of making products. And, just like I did I approached it like I was making my own art, basically.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. Yeah.
So, it's just a different perspective of how to go about doing this. And then as far as selling it, I never had to go, try to like call people and say, do you want to buy it? Everyone called me. So eventually Takach had it in its catalog, and then McLean's wanted it, then Graphic Chemical, and then it started spreading all over the world. Eventually we were in Europe, we were in Australia, New Zealand. Printmakers are, it's a niche group, but everybody knows everybody pretty much. So the word just spread. And, I was known also for teaching when pregnant women would come and say, oh, I hear you're teaching pregnant women. Like, sure.
What is it? So, Milan's classes, but like Milan's printmaking? Is that what they, where they teach you how to breathe? Yeah.
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 How to tie an apron. You're 9 months pregnant.
Right. Yeah. Do you go over, under? Yeah. Across? Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then so eventually Speedball comes into the picture, and you pass the torch a bit, but as you say, you've stayed on. What was that transition like for you? Was it sort of hard to let go of your baby, or were you ready to take on something new and let someone else handle the logistics for a while? Well,
the transition originally started like for 5 years. One day I get a phone call from Walt Glazer, who is the owner of Speedball. And, he calls at a time where everything was running very smoothly and I had it all in place. And, we were doing very well. And I thought, wow, why would I want to, give this up? So I said, let me think about it, maybe, I want to spend more time with my own artwork, but I'm not, ready. So we had lots of meetings and discussions, and I really, really liked the team at Speedball, and I felt very comfortable with them. And so eventually, we talked and we worked it out that I was, happy. I got to stay on. I got to do other projects with them. And so it worked out very, very, as everything else did, just smoothly, just taking one day at a time and letting it happen, not forcing anything. And I'm still with them. And this was 2012 that they actually acquired Akua. And I've been with them. I'm in New York. When they first had to manufacture it, I spent a lot of time in Statesville, North Carolina, and in the factory I worked with Bud Martin, and we came up with a nice quality control. So they would be able to handle that. I worked with the staff. Oh, everybody took a workshop. I went to North Carolina, and all their staff did a printmaking workshop with me, and so everybody got to know the products, and I was just really happy that it was more family and it wasn't like a big corporation taking over.
Totally. And it's, we work with Speedball too, the podcast, and it's always just good vibes. Like and I can imagine that you maybe had a similar experience where you're like, oh, like they're kind of a big name. And then you start to interact with them and you really can tell it's such a special company because every person you interact with, every person that we've interacted with, they have this warmth and this passion that you can tell this is really coming from the right place. And it's just so wonderful to be involved in that and have it just feel like a big print family. Yeah.
Yes. And that's why it's easy for me to let go. And I'm still involved. So, if it were something where it was straightforward and like, goodbye, I think that would have been hard, but it just felt like the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And, this way I have more time to do my work. And it got to the point where, everything was working so well. And, being a problem solver, I started getting bored. There's no more problems to really solve. So then I knew that was the time I should let go, and it was in good hands.
Yeah. That sounds like it had the arc that it was meant to have, for sure. And I really like what you were saying about not being in a hurry and really letting things kind of evolve naturally. And it really makes me think about, something that Tim and I have been talking about, especially since we've had to do pandemics and lockdowns and everything, is really that letting go a little bit and letting things happen sort of as the universe lets them unfold. And as opposed to before, we just had this sense of like, I have to control everything. I have to steer this ship exactly where I think it should go. And if we've really had to take on anything in the last 18 months, it's more of that attitude that it sounds like you were able to have that's just, like, I'm going to see where this goes and it's going to end up where it's supposed to. And I think that is just such a healthier way to live. I certainly am much more relaxed and happier since I've just released that, out into the world. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I feel like this is a great point to transition to talking about your own work. Because as you were saying, transitioning Akua to being in the Speedball family afforded you a bit more time for your own practice. And, you interact with printmaking in a really interesting way. You do a lot of sculptural work. And so I'd like to step back in time again a little bit and kind of get to the point where, you said you were interested in printmaking because you didn't want to make that choice. So between the sculpture and the painting. And so were you always thinking about printmaking in this sculptural way? Or was there a moment when you were like, well, wait, why does this have to lie flat on a sheet of paper? Like, why can't I turn it into something else? Or was it just sort of there all along?
I think as I was learning printmaking, I tried to stick with the rules in school, but I was never good at doing assignments. I always had to change the assignment. That's why I had a hard time with school. So instead of doing an edition and signing each print, I just started binding them together and printing on both sides. And that's how I got into book arts. And then the book arts became sculpture because I would take holograph plates and make them the holograph plate of the prints, which were all printed differently. I did not have the patience to try to print each plate the same way each time because there's so many ways you could do it.
Yeah.
So then I would bind everything together. The collagraph plate became the cover of the book. And then, as like we were saying before, you just kind of go with the flow. And so the books became sculptural books. Then the sculptural books became sculpture. And then the idea of the monotype and how each one is different, and they could be slightly different. I started thinking of motion a lot.
Yeah.
And that's how I became, interested in animation and stop motion animation. So I thought, wow, it's like, I should stop here. No, make one more mark. No, stop here. So then I thought I should document this. So then I started documenting each monotype, mark, and that became stop motion. And then I thought, well, I might as well embed this animation into the books. So at that point, I started taking the pieces and inserting. I would do my animation, and then the video. I would use those frames, those digital frames, and put the animation in the digital frame, and then take the digital frame and then put it back into the book. So then they became digital sculptural books.
Yeah, yeah. And then the sculpture work that I've seen from you, it really it's incredibly detailed, and it has this very organic feel to it. What's your actual process of making the sculptures and giving them that kind of softness and that really detailed ins and outs and just incredibly textured? And of course, you invite people to actually touch the work, so they need to also be durable to a certain extent. What is that process like?
Well, after I bind everything together, I make my concoctions. I usually use a lot of gritty things like sand, crushed glass, and I mix it up, and then I paint the surface so that it feels like it was dug up out of the ground. I don't want my work to look like I made it. I want it to look like it was, sort of found, like it was a discovery. So I try to make it look like maybe I'll paint a surface that has like a moss effect or a mud effect. It's all paint, and I make my own sort of formulations so it's real gritty and just sort of mimicking the environment and how something may look if I buried it in the ground, and then 20 years now somebody finds it.
Yeah, and I think that absolutely it has that quality to it where they look ancient. They look like something that if you were on a hike in the woods and you saw it, you'd be like, maybe this is an artifact. Maybe it's actually just supposed to be part of this tree. It really would, I think, puzzle people. And so I know that, not to do the classic artist interview thing, which is to read an artist statement back to them. But one of the things you say about it is that you're interested in sort of this effects of time and nature's cycle, and then how humans impact the environment. And I think that is so beautifully illustrated in your works that for me sort of sit in between something that looks natural and human made and really kind of question that sort of line, I think, aesthetically. And so when it comes to the effects of time, natural things often have this sort of sense of time to them because, of course, rocks are forever, trees live longer than us. And yet humans have these dramatic impacts on what is essentially old beings. And I just feel that in your work when I look at it. And I just wonder kind of how you came to that aesthetic of being able to capture that sense of like disrupted time in a way.
Wow. Thank you. I guess I just work from my heart and, I feel things so immensely, and I also do research. And currently I'm an artist in residence at the New York Historical Society Museum. And I've been doing some research with the with Central Booking Art, and it's a group of artists who the focus on their art is sculptural book or just book arts.
Yeah.
And so we've been going to the museum and doing some research, but then the pandemic happened, and I was looking into antique maps of New York and specifically the waterfront of Brooklyn. So I used my imagination. I took those maps, and I feel that they're documents of time, and to press them into a book and if I were to bury them, and then, and how maps change and how our environment's changing and how the waterfront is changing. So I kind of just think about, I use my imagination of what it was like then, what it's like now, what it's like in the future. So, these are things that go on in my mind, and they just come out in my work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's some reality, I think basing it on an actual map, there is that reality, but the word is not the work. My work is not literal. It's not like, I'm trying to, the story just evolves just because I'm working on it, and the pieces take time. So every day is different. If I'm working on one piece at a time, the story just evolves from not only the time that I imagine, but the time that I'm present, the time that I put into the work, layers and layers of growth and decay.
Yeah. And they really look like that. And they're incredibly detailed, and you have absolutely lovely documentation on your website. So I really encourage anyone to go to your website and take a look, particularly as we're talking, because they're a little bit difficult to just describe in terms of they are so sort of visceral and textural. And what's interesting is listening to you talk now about the maps, it occurs to me that maps are such a way that humans try to tame nature, this through the use of a map, because the what's scary about nature, it's the unknown. You could get lost. You don't know what's out there. Here be dragons, right? But once something is mapped, that fear kind of gets taken away, and we have the illusion that, okay, we know what's there. It's somehow now it's in the realm of human knowledge. And so therefore we have some control over it, some semblance of control, which of course is a misnomer, is not actually accurate. But I think that's really interesting to see, particularly with the printmaking sculptures, the way it looks like the growth is wrapping back around, or so you call them sculptural prints. That it looks like that nature is wrapping back around the images of maps and kind of almost reclaiming it. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but that's definitely where it brings me. Yeah.
Oh, I love what you just said. I think that's so, how I feel. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm glad that you kind of caught on to that.
Yeah. And then you've got the sculptural books and the sculptural prints organized separately, in the way that you've sort of organized your bodies of work. And how are they particularly different to you? Do you go about them differently? Are they created differently? What's the real distinction, either thematically or philosophically or technically, between the two bodies of work?
Good question. Well, I think, my background with sculptural books is that a book has a spine. So I always sort of work off of that spine, like that's what holds it together. So then things are inserted and attached to the spine. So they become more book-like in that relation. Now, when I have a sculptural print, it doesn't really have that spine, although there is some sense of, a balance or if they stand or if they hang on the wall, it's a different feeling than a book. And the books are intimate in a way. Some of them, they're not that intimate anymore because they're huge. But when I first started out doing this type of work, I wanted I wanted people to touch them. I wanted them to hold them and really feel what I felt when I made the work.
Mm.
They're soft. There's certain areas that are soft. Because of the mud like quality, maybe. And then there's areas that are very rough and coarse, and it's like all these different sort of textures that give it a different feel than if you were just looking at a piece on the wall.
Right.
I feel like, yay, get in there, touch it, and people would like say, oh my gosh, there's a little dust, like something fell off, and it's like, it's okay. It's part of the piece, it's like,
Yeah.
it's not that fragile, it changes. And I'd love to see my work, I'm going to probably bury a few pieces in my backyard, but, that's part of it, is that's what gives the work life. It's not, total plastic that may just stay exactly the same way, in 100 years. It's may change, and that's okay. I hope I'm around to see some changes.
Mm-hmm. And so with that attitude towards the work that, it has this life where it can evolve and it can change, that's so very much, I think, against very strong art world conventions about preservation and conservation. And the gallery that I work at in Bangkok, SAC Gallery, it has a whole conservation department. And, I can only imagine my dear, conservation lead Phi just sweating, like listening to you talk about it, and just like,
yeah.
no, it's not supposed to do that. I have to protect all the art, because that's of course what they've dedicated their lives and their passions to. And so I'm wondering, do you ever run into some resistance, either from your gallerist or from a museum, or someone who can't really understand that you've put in a tremendous amount of effort to create these really detailed, intimate objects. And then also part of that life cycle is their degradation a bit, and that they have their own life, and that as they interact with different people, they change. Is that a bit of a challenge sometimes?
Oh, yeah. I've heard like, oh, fungi, well, don't put it close to my other work,
Right.
Especially, in the book arts collections, they're afraid to bring, like, if it's a library collection, because some libraries collect art as books, and they're afraid of the fungi and contamination. But then there are others that are like open to that. There's a lot of work today that's, this is nothing new.
Right. Yeah.
And I sold a few pieces to the Yale Museum, or the Yale Gallery. They have a collection. It's the Alan Sharnoff collection of book arts. And it's an incredible collection. And when he collected the works, he did not, there's so much work like mine that they know how to protect it. Because I sold some pieces. I was really concerned because I sold some pieces in like the late 80s or early 90s, and then they opened it up, and they know how to protect it. They have it, down.
Yeah.
And they had an exhibition a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I went to see the show, and I was so afraid. And they had it in a glass display case, and it looked perfect. It looked better than any of the works that I still have here. And I think because I don't know how to do that type of conserving. I have some boxes archival, but then I put work in there. And sometimes I open up certain things and I see things starting to degrade. But the museum there, they knew how to take care of that collection, and they have an incredible collection of book arts there, and all the work looked really good. So, it depends on who's, managing it. If they're prepared for that, if it's a library and they have other works that they're concerned about, they're conservative, they may not.
Yeah.
But, it's out there.
Yeah, because it's listed as preserved fungi, in the official, tally of what creates your medium, or your media, I should say. And is that, I assume that also means that it's dead fungi, or, that they're not going to keep growing and, find their way into some precious 14th century books out there somewhere? Because that's what I imagine anyway when I read it. But is it actually preserved? I don't know. I guess fungi are just such interesting things, and like what is alive and what's dead and where does one stop and the other begin? There are all kinds of questions in that way. But they must be quite safe, I would guess, if they're preserved. That implies that they're not continuing to change, at least, or spread. Yeah.
I hope. They're dried.
Okay.
And so there's so many types. There's some that are solid, and I've never even seen one little dust particle come off any spores. And then some of them, it depends on when and how they're picked as well. And you can see when they're real like punky. When they're really soft. I will add extra wax. I like to make mixtures of wax with some other materials to add that extra, coating that will prevent it from happening.
Right.
But so far, so good, So I don't know. I don't really have the answers for it. But I just know what I'm doing at the moment.
Right. And I think that's, a part of artworks and art practices that are challenging conventions and are kind of pushing boundaries about, what is considered an art material, is that there are some questions that we don't have answers to. We know what ink on paper looks like when it's 400 years old, 500 years old. But we don't necessarily know what fungi will look like because no one's done it, so we're just going to have to wait and see and, use the best guesses that people have. We've got a show on at the gallery right now at SAC that's an artist who's been using pesticides because his work is all about the tremendous pressure that Thai farmers are under to really put chemicals on their crops to have a big yield, which of course is pushing the soil towards soil collapse. And he uses the actual pesticides in the work. And, he says, like, I've sealed them. They're fine. It's not leaking. And you're in the gallery looking at them like, yeah, I'm sure that's fine. Just like the chemicals. And it's, and so, when we get questions from, say, like collectors, like, what is this going to hold its color for 10 years? You're like, well, I don't know because no one's done this before. And so it's interesting to have this conversation with you because I've been having similar thoughts about, the way artworks evolve and particularly when you're using new media, the way they might change and that you need to change expectations. And I think also maybe question why we insist on this sort of preciousness and timelessness in works of art in some way as well, that we resist the idea of them adapting and changing when of course change is absolutely innate, and there's always that weird side, I think, of conservation where you see people slaving over, getting just this tiny bit right and repainting something so it matches entirely or preserving it. And sometimes I'm just like, yeah, but like oceans are rising, like you see, and you're sometimes like, you're like, I hope that many more people get to see it. But, like a lot of artwork is in Venice, and you're like that's at greater risk than just a humidity shift, Yeah, like so at some point something will change, and at some point the art will turn back into carbon and dust, like we all will. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
Very, very well said.
I know. I was like, oh, shoot, I'm running out of interview time too. Is that a good note to end on? I don't know. But,
well, I could talk to you forever, and because you're a very interesting person and very thought-provoking.
Oh, well, it's really been really wonderful to chat with you and to hear the story of Akua that would have been Akua Inks, but are now our beloved Akua Inks, and to talk about your work because it's really incredible. And like I said, I highly encourage anyone to look it up and experience it digitally, although I know that tactile experience is a big part of, for you, your viewers' experience of it. So of course, please see it in person if you can. And I really appreciate you spending some time with me this morning. And I know you're going to stick around for a little bit and talk to Tim. Is that correct? And chat and do some shop talk? Okay.
Yes, looking forward to it.
Beautiful.
Well, thank you, Miranda. It was wonderful talking to you. I really enjoyed this interview.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so pleased we got to connect, and I hope we stay in touch. And I would love to see some of your work in person someday. So hopefully we'll get a chance to connect and do that. I would really like that.
I would too. And I always enjoy your podcasts.
Oh, thank you.
A really wonderful group of interviewers and interviewees.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's our show for this week. Join me again next week when my guest will be Josh Epstein, also known as Totes Faroche. We'll talk about his wonderful images of gay men and kink created in the linocut process, queerness in Sailor Moon, being an art class darling, what makes art queer, and the role of galleries in the post-COVID world. You won't want to miss it. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing by Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you next week.